Hello, I'm Elaine Petrocelli, and I'm from Book Passage, and I'm so happy to have you here this evening. I know we have a wonderful group of people from all over the world who are here to spend this hour with Jacqueline Winspear. In the green room, we were talking, and when the pandemic hit, Jackie stepped right up and helped us. This is our fourth pandemic Jacqueline Winspear experience. She did two for her own books, for The Consequences of Fear, and for This Time Next Year, We'll Be Laughing. And then she also interviewed Elizabeth George for us. And now I'm so excited that she is here for her beautiful new book, A Sunlit Weapon. And I do want to remind you that if for any reason you missed The Consequences of Fear, it's out in paperback now. Yeah. And it starts in 1941, but here we are in 1942, this absolutely brilliant book. And the cover is just fabulous. It really, every time I'm reading it, and I've read it twice because I love it, I find myself wanting to pet the cover. So Jackie, would you just start by telling us a little bit about how this book came about? Because here we are on your 17th Maisie Dobbs book. I remember reading the first one.
Yes.
I've said before, I went home for lunch thinking I'd read a few pages and never came back to work. They're still looking for me. But this is so on point for where we are in the world right now. But tell me, how did you come to the idea of these women ferrying pilots?
Okay, well, gosh, it's a long story. You know, I think the truth is that as writers, one of the things we do, we squirrel things away. Mm-hmm. And not just since we've been writing, there are memories, there are people we've met over the years, even from childhood, that we can draw upon conversations, meetings, and so on. And I first became interested in the role of the ATA, the Air Transport Auxiliary. It was founded in 1939 in Britain. It was a government organization, but not part of the RAF. And it was founded to literally to bring pilots together, hire pilots that some of them were ex-World War I pilots, some were commercial pilots working for the then British Airways or whatever, and others were people who just had, you know, the experience and they had their pilot's licenses, many of whom were women. But anyway, they were brought together to ferry aircraft because the RAF did not have the manpower. They needed the manpower for battle. They needed the pilots to go up and you know, in bombers, in fighter aircraft and so on. They couldn't have them just saying, oh, well, this plane needs to go to the maintenance depot. This plane needs to go here. This plane needs to go there. So they had the Air Transport Auxiliary was for the ferrying of aircraft. And 10% of the complete number of pilots working for the Air Transport Auxiliary were women. And they were in right from the beginning. They were actually the first government employees to ever gain pay parity with men, which was quite extraordinary in those days. And the wonderful stories that I read and heard and so on, but I first became interested in them many years ago, as I often say, in the last ice age, when I actually worked for an airline. And I met the mother of one of the girls I worked alongside, and she'd been an aviatrix in the Air Transport Auxiliary. And I didn't have much time to talk to her, but the idea of it was just, oh, that's really interesting. You know, that's something I'd have done, you know. And many of those initial women pilots were, they had already had their pilot's licenses. Flying was one of those things that if you had the money, it was a hobby that drew young women. I mean, there was an opportunity for you to soar, an opportunity for you to have this independence. They worked as flight instructors. They worked in what was then, these flying circuses where they just fly into a place and give rides and so on and so forth. And some were working as commercial pilots at one level or another. And but there they were in the Air Transport Auxiliary. And initially, I mean, number one, the RAF, who, whilst they weren't, it was not an RAF department or anything, they didn't like the idea of women pilots. Women shouldn't be flying planes. Women can't fly. Well, in fact, those women could fly. And initially, they were given the worst jobs. They were the ones that had to ferry the open cockpit training aircraft. And they always had to take them to somewhere like Prestwick in Scotland in the middle of winter when it's freezing cold. And not until they got their Sidcot suits, which were kind of like padded duvet type suits, did they actually get warm. But they proved their mettle, and literally they were soon flying all manner of aircraft. And in fact, pretty much most women in the ATA, they nicknamed them the Atta Girls. Atta Girl, you can do it, But they were flying many more flying hours than the young men in the RAF, and they were licensed to fly many more aircraft. And in fact, there's a wonderful story told by Mary Ellis, who was she died a few years ago at the age of 101. But the first time she brought in a Lancaster bomber. Lancaster bomber was a big bomber, big 4-engine bomber, and it normally had a 7-man crew. And she brought it into, she'd had to ferry it from maybe a maintenance depot to, one of the bomber air stations. And the guy came up with the steps, and she came down, and she was very short, about 5'2" or something. And he said, "Well, where's the pilot?" She said, "Well, I am the pilot." And he said, "Don't be silly." And he ran. They were looking for the crew, and she said, "Look, I just brought this in. You've got to sign this off for me because I've got to get out of here because I've got to take a Hurricane to somewhere else." And they would fly maybe 4 or 5 aircraft in a day, and they would go from a bomber to a Spitfire to a Hurricane to a Blenheim, boom, 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 boom. And they also brought aircraft across the Atlantic. There was also the Canadian Air Force women pilots who did that as well. And they had a big job. And the interesting thing is, and I'm going to ramble and then be quiet so you can talk a bit, but there were a number of American pilots, male American pilots, that came over when war was first declared, and some of them were, they were working in agricultural areas or whatever, but they joined the RAF, and a squadron was formed called the Eagle Squadron. And one of the reasons they came over was because everybody wanted to fly the Spitfire. If you were a pilot, you wanted to get in the Spitfire because it was the fastest aircraft in the world. It would go at 400 miles an hour, and you could have some fun with it. And there were also there were women pilots came from other parts of the world. There were the Polish young women from Poland. There was an Argentinian, a couple of Czech, Canadian, and there were Americans. And in fact, one of them, Jacqueline Cochran, who worked with the ATA for a while, she eventually went back to the United States, and she founded the WASPs, which was a similar thing. But the reason they all came, it was the Spitfire. And they always said that the Spitfire was a ladies' aircraft because it was, it was very tight inside. And Mary Ellis said something about in a documentary about the Spitfire, which is going to sound, I have to be careful here, but she said the Spitfire was a lady in the air, but she was a bitch on the ground. And that was because she was so hard to handle as an aircraft on the ground. But in the end, once you got that plane into the air, they had some fun with it.
And early in the book, we meet Joe Hardy, who is a pilot and who loves flying the Spitfire, and in fact gets herself in a little bit of
bother.
Yeah. But did you know someone just like her? I mean, she is a great character. I loved her. And as you were talking about these women and how determined they were, I thought about in the book when she wants Maisie to do something, she isn't patient.
Mhm.
She wants what she needs to have. And
Mhm.
I thought she was marvelous character, but of course she did things that she wasn't exactly supposed to do with her Spitfire.
No.
Was that really common?
Well, there's this one story, and I'm trying to. I think it might have even been the Argentinian. I can't remember which pilot it was, but literally, she was bringing her Spitfire in, to deliver the Spitfire, and your job was you had to get your aircraft to its destination on time, in one piece, no skylarking around, But these were young. You forget that they're kids, really. They're in their early 20s and so on. And, we forget that they're the people that go to war. Usually it's youngsters. And anyway, before bringing it into land, she thought, I'm going to do a few barrel rolls. And so she was doing a loop-the-loop, did barrel roll and having some fun. And literally there was an RAF officer, because that's who you're delivering to, the RAF, on the ground, absolutely steaming. And he wanted to tear this young chap off a strip. And he was going to just put him on whatever he could do. And he was totally disarmed when she brought the Spitfire in for a perfect landing, got out of the, cockpit, got onto the ground, pulled off her helmet and shook out her long hair and just walked up and said, hello, sir. Could you sign my chit for me, please? So I've landed. And he couldn't say a word. He was totally, just floored and just walked off in a huff, because not only did the woman bring the plane in for a perfect landing, but boy, could she loop the loop, And so Joe is, I've never known a Joe, so to speak, but I think you had to have something of a Joe about you to do this job, because it was a very, very, very dangerous job. The ferry pilots, plane, when they took on a plane, it deliberately, it didn't have any weaponry on board. They didn't have anything to tell them, they had to use their eyes. They had to know the route, and it was pretty darn basic. And they just had to hope that if they were flying through a sudden fog bank, they didn't hit a hill, which actually happened to one woman. I mean, she was killed. Another woman was flying a plane to a breaker's yard, and unfortunately she was killed when literally the propeller just dropped off mid-flight. Can you imagine? It just dropped off. And so, if they were flying to somewhere like Biggin Hill, or an aircraft bring it into Tangmere, or one of the, say a bomber station or whatever, and they encountered a lone wolf Luftwaffe pilot in a Messerschmitt, which actually had bullets on board that were far more damaging than the ones carried on the Spitfire, interestingly enough. But if they came across one, the only thing that would get them out of trouble was airmanship. It was knowing how to handle that aircraft. And sometimes they had to fly an aircraft with only maybe 20 minutes. Oh, you're flying a Hurricane down to so-and-so. Oh, you've not flown one before? Here's the handbook. That's how it went. Boom, boom, boom. And then you were off. I mean, it was a very maverick in its way.
Incredible. But Joe does get into problem.
She does.
There is death, and there is, of course, because for all the things that we love about your Maisie Dobbs and your standalones, the development of the characters, especially with Maisie, watching her grow, and we can talk about that some more in a bit, but could you talk a little bit about what happened? And I don't want to give the story away, so I'm trying to keep it to the first quarter of the book and not talk about the ending, but I think the way she came to Maisie is really important.
Yes, and I have to be very careful. I always remember being at Book Passage once doing one of my events, and I actually said to the audience of readers, I have to be very careful here, because I don't want to give anything away here. And I heard someone say, well, you did that 5 minutes ago. It's so difficult. But basically, Jo, she's bringing a Spitfire into Biggin Hill Aerodrome, which was one of the main fighter aerodromes in the southeast during the war. And yeah, she's flying a bit low because there's a reason that she wants to fly a bit low. And she is aware that someone is taking pot shots at her aircraft. Fast forward a bit, later someone else another pilot is actually killed in the same area, and there is evidence, even though it's declared a pilot error, there is evidence to suggest that it's not an error, there was something else going on. And there was also this issue with when Jo goes to investigate the barn where she thought she saw someone shooting at her, she finds an American serviceman bound, tied up, and basically left in a very poor state. He is very ill, locked away in that barn. So she finds out about Maisie Dobbs from someone that readers have met before. Her name is Elaine Otterburn. And Elaine, if you've read Journey to Munich, Maisie came to Elaine's assistance, and Elaine got a very important person out of Munich. She is an absolutely crack pilot, and she's just brought an aircraft in from Canada, and then along with Jo, they have to take a couple of Hurricanes down to another air station in Kent. And as there are all these events that happen, which of course I'm going to skim over, and Jo says that she wants to get to the bottom of what's been happening. There's too much happening. She's got to find out what it is. And Elaine says to her, well, there's someone who will help you out, and this is her name. And she gives Jo Maisie's details in her office in Fitzroy Square. And Jo says, well, shall I say you sent me? And she said, well, I wouldn't if I were you. And there's always been a hint of this reason why basically Elaine wasn't Maisie's favorite person, although has tried very, very hard. And Elaine finally confesses that reason to Jo.
And when Jo gets to Maisie, Maisie's got her hands full at home. Mm-hmm. She's got a lot going on, but when she as you know, mm-hmm. for 17 books, we all feel we know Maisie well. She would not turn down this case. There's too much of interest in it because the man that Jo finds is not just any American serviceman. He's Black, and how come he was in the barn and what happened becomes really an important part of the story.
Very much so, yeah.
And you bring in racism, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the racism that the British see as the American problem and the British prejudices of their own.
Well, of course, in the year that this book is set, 1942, this was long before the race problems, the real race problems that emerged in the 1950s, when citizens from the Caribbean in particular were brought into the UK to take up jobs, and in some cases as strike breakers, which is never a recipe for initial racial harmony. There were actually about 7,000 to 8,000 people of color living in the United Kingdom at that point in the war years. And but they were mainly in the major cities, and often mainly near places where there was a docks or something like that, because that's how you got into a place. And there was, whilst there was sort of a mild racism, for example, I remember my mum telling me that there was a family that lived down the street, and the father was from the West Indies and the mum was white. And she said, well, no one bothered them and they didn't bother us, and we all played together, So there wasn't any overt, there's obviously episodes of racism, but you see in Britain, there is a different kind of, there was even more so then a different kind of, I would say, segregation, although it wasn't a formal segregation, and that is by class. And class always outweighs color in Britain. But the interesting thing that happened, I mean, obviously Britain had already been at war for a couple of years by the time Americans came into, were shipped out to the United Kingdom in early 1942. And we already had troops from across the empire in Britain. So obviously there was, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, but there was also the West Indies, places in Africa, and definitely India. So we had a lot of troops, and yes, they were absolutely welcome because we knew they were there to help and to serve and to do their bit, so to speak. But still, most people in rural areas had never seen a person of color. And suddenly you had the Americans coming in. Now, here's the thing. Before America entered the war, so to speak, apparently, Churchill was requested by the American government to set up some form of segregation in Britain because they didn't want blacks mixing with whites. And Churchill, given the fact that we had the empire there helping us out, of course he was going to say, no, we don't do that here. But the other thing is that, interestingly enough, pretty much all Black American soldiers were in maintenance units, which meant they were among the first to arrive because they had to build the bases, they had to build the runways, they had to, build roads in and out of places that didn't have roads. And a lot of these places were in rural areas. And they were very much welcomed. I mean, there was the whole romantic thing about, oh my gosh, they're from America, they're Americans. And they're Americans who've come here to do their bit. And in fact, they were often known as, and today this would not seem very complimentary, but it was a term of great affection then. They were known as darkies. And they were held with great affection by a lot of most of the local population. In fact, I read one excerpt from the diary of this woman. It was written when she was a little girl. And she was so excited because a darky soldier had come and held her hand as she walked down the street and was asked and chatting to her. And of course, one of the things was that soldiers from overseas, they had a real connection to the many evacuees that had been shipped out of the cities because they were all a long way from home. And there were many cases where the American military police tried to institute some sort of segregation and were literally chased off by the locals. And I mean, there were cases of, the Black American soldiers just in the line for the movie theater. And, along come the military police to try and get them to leave because, there are white people in this line. And suddenly they're being chased down, the military police being chased down the road by old ladies with umbrellas. And, they were allowed to go into the pubs. They could go into the pubs. There was even a little bit of mixing between the white and Black soldiers, but mostly, they knew their own place because, of course, they had different bases and things like that. But it was really interesting, some of the things that happened socially. For example, white American soldiers could not understand why British women would go to a dance and dance with a Black person because it was never done in America. But they couldn't understand, why are they dancing with them? And well, they're all youngsters in a time of war. Of course they want to dance. And, if you could dance, then, you were fair game, let's all dance. And I read a very sad reflection by one lady who had been invited to a dance that was set up in a village. And there were, girls going along that had been invited. And she walked in with her friend. She was a little bit late. And there were these white American soldiers and the girls were sitting there, or they were dancing with each other. And she said, well, why aren't these boys asking the girls to dance? And another girl said, well, we were in here dancing with the darkies yesterday, so they won't dance with us now. Isn't that sad? Isn't that sad? And there was also a situation, and I read this in, there were books on this subject, but they were mainly published in the 1970s. And about, and from the reflection of American soldiers, that of course, in Britain at that time, in England and Wales, I think about 46-47% of people were fortunate enough to have indoor bathroom facilities. The rest didn't. You had an outside WC. You didn't have an actual bathroom. You were lucky to have a tin bath in front of the fire. In Scotland, I must say, it was interesting. They actually had 2% more. They had 49%. It's a strange statistic. But in fact, it was interesting how most of the Black Americans were in the same situation at home. Therefore, they understood. They didn't make fun of the sort of the British hosts, whereas some British people felt that they were being looked down upon by Americans who actually had a much better lifestyle, much better. And also, they just had 2 years of war. Thousands of people were homeless. Thousands of people were living, 2 families to a house and things like that. And this was before they'd put up the prefabs at the end of the war, prefabricated housing, to help find people places to live. I mean, it was a dire situation. But the truth is that all Americans were welcomed heartily, because we knew what they were there for. The British knew what they were there for. And, it wasn't to go to dances. It was to fight. And America, fought hard in the war, along with, the soldiers from every other continent. And people were held in great affection. I mean, Americans were held in great affection. My mother-in-law, to whom the book is dedicated, was with the American Army Nursing Corps. And I get a bit choked up when I talk about her, but she shipped out on the Queen Mary, which was obviously not in her usual sterling livery, but painted grey, in fairly early in 1942. And she didn't go home until 1946. She was with the American Army Nursing Corps in uniform for all those years. And she told me some stories about what it was like being an American in Britain during the war.
But you point out that in Britain, there is a class prejudice.
Yeah.
And also prejudice of people who come from London when you get to the countryside. I don't know if that's still the case.
It's not the case now, no. But there definitely was back in the day, that it was, oh, you're a Londoner sort of thing. And there was, and I wrote about this in my memoir, This Time Next Year We'll Be Laughing, that, certain times of year when Londoners came into Kent, for example, for the hop picking, it wasn't unusual to see a sign on a pub door or something like that saying, no gypsies, no Londoners, and
amazing.
Yeah. And then, of course, there was as I say, the class thing as well.
But as we get into woven through every Maisie Dobbs book is family and love and people growing as they learn, including Maisie herself. And Maisie's daughter, Anna, who is adopted and Maltese, out of the Maltese father, she has terrible problems at this village school. Could you
it's
a little bit about that?
Well, she has this lovely olive colouring, and she has been very happy at the village school, and suddenly they get a new headmistress. And, after Mussolini threw in his lot with Hitler and Italy became an enemy, there was obviously lots of anti-Italian feeling in the United Kingdom. And, there's internment of Italian or people of Italian heritage and so on. And, there were Italian restaurants that were firebombed and so on and so forth. I mean, we've seen that sort of behavior here. We've seen it around the world, which is incredibly sad. And she is unfortunately mistaken for an Italian. and she suffers accordingly. And she's not the only one to suffer in the school, because Billy, his daughter, is also going to the school because, from previous books, you'll know that Maisie helped the family to live in the little village to get them out of London. And of course, Margaret Rose has, just like her dad, she's got a Cockney accent. And so that has marked her as being, one of the London kids. So, it's just the sort of thing that happens, unfortunately. Children hear things at home, and the next thing you know, they're replicating the behavior. So it's something Maisie has to deal with, and she is it's actually a real, she has to look hard at herself, because she's realized just what she would do for her daughter, just what she would do to protect her daughter. And there's some surprising information emerges around the school, so to speak.
And someone in the book, I can't remember whether it's Mark or someone else, points out that kind of bullying or problems in offices or wherever come from the top.
Yeah.
And as you put, the change of headmistress, changing the situation, I thought, that's so wise. I've worked places where the boss was somebody who had a method of, why don't you and him fight so that I can take advantage of both of you. But I also love, and I love it in every book, because Maisie is a psychologist. She's introspective, but she also thinks about why people are the way they are.
Yes.
I can learn from that. I have trouble with that.
She tries to get to the heart, which is why very often, she will see the victim inside the perpetrator of a crime. What makes people like that? And, it's interesting because, I have always sort of thought like that as well. And I truly think it goes back to when I was a teen and my mother's job. My mother actually worked for the Home Office, the government department, the Home Office, and particularly the prisons department. And she was the chief administrator of several different prisons. In fact, had she accepted the job, she decided not to, she would have been the first woman chief administrator of one of Britain's top high security prisons. But when she was sort of earlier in her career, she was the administrator at a detention center, which was for boys 16 to 21, and it was their second offense. Usually they got probation for a first offense. And she it wasn't a disciplinary role, it was purely administration, although she had a lot of interaction with the inmates, so to speak. I can remember her coming home one day and she was really quite down. And I made her a cup of tea, and she obviously never spoke about her work. It was highly confidential. I mean, she wouldn't name names or anything like that. And, and I said, have you had a hard day, Mum? And she said, yeah, just had a problem with one of the kids, so to speak. And I said to her, Mum, what makes people end up, because I was of an age that some of these inmates were. And I said, well, what makes people end up in there? What makes these, young boys do? And they weren't, you couldn't say, oh, they're from working class backgrounds, because they weren't. They were all backgrounds. She said, what? I said, what makes them do what they do, and how do they end up inside? And she said, to be honest, Jackie, she said, somewhere along the line, someone just didn't care enough. Someone didn't care enough. And I've never forgotten that. And I always bring that, to my writing. And I think, where did the caring stop that this person, and of course there is such a thing as human evil, people that for one reason or another, they're not very nice. But what is the point where someone makes a decision to do something that harms another and does something that the rest of us, we would skid to a halt, and you wonder I always wonder, where did the caring end? And is it a collective caring that someone high up did not care about all those young men they sent to war and what the outcome might be? Was it a different kind of caring that actually drove someone into crime? As our friendly detective inspector says in this one, everybody's being a criminal right now. Well, that happened in Britain in the war. People were very hungry, so they'd take stolen goods, if they could. No one was going to turn their noses up at it. But there is this question of who is the victim inside the perpetrator of a crime. What went wrong?
I think that's part of the brilliance of your writing, in that I read a lot of mysteries. I love mysteries, but I often don't know why someone is the way they are. And it's making me think about that in life too. So it's really pretty amazing. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the fact that while this book is going on, Eleanor Roosevelt is coming to visit the United Kingdom.
Yeah. It's interesting that one of the things I've done over the years, I've made notes of historical events, or not just themes that I wanted to weave into my books. And when I finished one book, I don't suddenly get the idea for another one. When I write the next book, it's usually something that I had the idea for years ago. And I knew that if and when I set a book in this particular year, I felt I wanted to include this visit by Eleanor Roosevelt. It was too big a thing to ignore. She was invited to the United Kingdom by Queen Elizabeth, who, and I don't mean the present Queen Elizabeth because she was only Princess Elizabeth then. It was Queen Elizabeth who became the Queen Mother. And she invited Eleanor Roosevelt to Britain to observe Britain's women in the war work they were doing. Because just as in the First World War, women were deployed in almost every field of endeavor. And of course, at that point, when the invitation was extended, America had only just come into the war. And so Eleanor Roosevelt made the journey with her secretary. And it was an interesting story. They came under assumed names. And they obviously, the flight was a bit convoluted because they had to go into Shannon. And she only had exactly the same baggage allowance as everybody else, even though she was going to be doing some really posh functions and so on. And one pair of shoes and things like that. The poor woman had to wear the same clothes time and time and time again. She actually wore holes in her shoes and had to stuff her shoes with newspaper. And she had it was a long and arduous itinerary. She landed in Shannon. And she was under an assumed name, as was her secretary. But as soon as she got off the plane, everybody knew who she was because the woman was 6 feet tall. She's very distinctive. And eventually she flew into Southampton, I think it was, and then came up to London on the train because the King and Queen would never, ever meet someone off at an airfield. That was not what the royal family did then. If they were going to meet someone, it was always off the train. And she came by train, which actually gave the ambassador, John Wynant, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, Wynant or Wynant, a chance to brief her. But she had a really grueling, packed itinerary. And she met everybody from, the munitions workers to the Wrens, the ATS, obviously things like the Mechanized Transport Corps, and of course the women of the Air Transport Auxiliary. That she was very impressed with. She really wanted something similar to happen in the United States, and but of course, quite the target. And they were very aware that it was a massive security operation looking after her, because Germany would have loved to have taken out Eleanor Roosevelt. And in fact, it was the day after her visit to Canterbury Cathedral and the small village of Barham in Kent. There was a massive air attack on Canterbury Cathedral. The Luftwaffe, they got the date wrong. Had they been a day earlier, she might well have been killed, but she wasn't because they got the date wrong. But it was, and of course, her son was serving in Britain at the time, her son Elliot. And there's this lovely story, and then I'll be quiet, but there was this lovely story I read that she had a driver taking her to see her son. While she was in Britain, she had a code name, and the code name was Rover. Rover was at the time also the popular name for a dog, but Rover, of course, is someone who is likely to just rove off, which she was. And they were on their way to take Eleanor Roosevelt to meet her son, Elliot, and they got lost. And because all the road signs were down. And luckily, the driver obviously had a radio, and he radioed in to say, Rover has lost her pup, need help, which I thought was amazing. But she made such an impression. One of her first stops, she was barely off the train, she was in the East End of London. And she was amazed that people who had been bombed so badly, people who had lost so many family members, they had lost their homes, they had lost everything, were turning out to greet her. It touches me.
Beautiful. And it's such an example of great leadership, which we're seeing right now in the
in Ukraine.
Ukraine. Normally, I believe that when an American president's family comes to another country, they stay in the embassy. But didn't she stay in Buckingham Palace?
She spent, I think, a night or two in Buckingham Palace. She went to Chequers. She stayed in different places. Interesting enough, as soon as she arrived, she was issued with a ration book, which was everybody had at the time. But in Buckingham Palace, she must have had a really miserable time. I'm sure her feet were killing her. It was freezing cold because they only had in one of these big rooms. Literally, everybody was conserving energy. They were conserving everything, let's face it. There was boards at the windows because Buckingham Palace had, in fact, been bombed, and there was no glass in many of the windows. She had an electric fire in the room with just one bar lit. And to have a bath, literally, and you imagine at the end of the day, you like a nice warm bath. Yeah, there's a big black line around the inside of the bath so that you only had 5 inches of water. You had to shut the water off at 5 inches. And I think that's amazing. But she insisted that she would not be treated any differently from anybody else. Well, of course, not many people get to go and sleep at Buckingham Palace. I'm sure she was freezing cold. And it was interesting, though. There was an account by a young woman who was in the Wrens, the Women's Royal Naval Service. And there was a luncheon held with different women from different services. And the woman from the Wrens said, it was great. It's the first time I've had a good meal in months and months and months, because they pulled out the stops because Mrs. Roosevelt was having lunch. But so anyway, she wrote a lot about her visit in her column, My Day. And of course, everybody was terrified that she would give away too much about where she was staying and so on and so forth for security reasons. But she just made a wonderful impression. But I understand, towards the end of her visit, the president wanted her home. He wanted her back because she was such a big, an important person in America. People loved her. And although there were people that didn't love her because she could be outspoken on certain issues that we've already covered, and that plays into the story as well. But he said, get her back safely. And which was, you can imagine, if you were on a ship, there was the U-boat threat. If you were in the air, there was the Luftwaffe. Nothing was easy. Nothing was easy. And it was very brave of her to come to the United Kingdom.
And Maisie's husband, Mark Scott, is an attaché at the American Embassy. And Maisie is working on a case that crosses something they promised they would never do, because she is getting in his territory.
Yeah.
I love the way you handled their, shall we say, disagreement. But
Yeah.
what a brilliant but dangerous situation to be part of something that is really ominous. And and here's your partner. She's the detective, and she's mucking around from his point of view, I should think. I thought that was beautifully handled. So,
well, thank you. Yeah, it's. I think it's something that happens to a lot of people today, and certainly then, it happened to people, but maybe in a different way. With particularly women who served in the services, and their husband or their partner was fiance was overseas, and just as in the First World War, doing your bit, so to speak, it was a real confidence builder. And you saw that definitely. There's one of the characters is in the Women's Land Army, and it's changed her life, coming from the streets of London, and she doesn't want to go back, ever. And she said it's made a strong woman of her. And of course, Maisie and Mark have to really tiptoe in their situation, tiptoe around one another. But of course, they've also helped one another as well. But it was interesting finding out that the nickname for, because there was the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, and then where General Eisenhower had his headquarters was sort of next door, and they referred to it as Eisenhowerplatz. And that was from within the American Embassy. They called it Eisenhowerplatz. And that's they're a law into themselves in there. Yeah.
Yes, that trip. For those of you who haven't read it, and I don't think very many have, since you would have had to start it this morning. This is a delicious part of the book. We have a question from the audience. Our fan says, I know Jackie makes, I love how Jackie makes the past come alive in her books. And what type of reading do you do, Jackie, to capture that fascinating time? And are there any fiction writers from that time that you read, and I'll add and perhaps recommend, because I want more books?
Actually, I've got to tell you, I tend to keep away from fiction. And the reason being that you can, it's very easy to kind of absorb someone else's voice, and I don't ever want to risk that. And it was an exercise I did in high school, believe it or not, that left me with that sense. We were asked to read something and then write something of our own, and you couldn't help but sound like the author you just read. And I thought, if I ever become a writer, I'm never going to do that. But actually, it's not just reading that I do for my research. I look at a lot of old footage. I was, finding online footage from Eleanor Roosevelt's visit to Britain. And of course, one of the things she referred to on more than one occasion when she was over was her time spent in Britain as a teenager. She, between the ages of 15 and 18, she was at a school in Britain, and she didn't really want to go back because she was enjoying it so much. It was called, I think, Allenswood Academy. It was just outside of Wimbledon. So she knew Britain. And she often made jokes about, I came prepared for the weather because I know what it's like, because she was there at a time of year when you got a fair bit of rain. So I've always enjoyed watching old sort of excerpts, the old Pathé News, for example, and also listening to audio. And I used to do that a lot more because, well, I haven't been able to do it for the last few years because I've not been able to travel to the UK, but I would do that a lot at the Imperial War Museum. I love listening to the voices of people when they're talking about their experiences. Plus, here's the thing. I still have two aunts, two of my mother's sisters are still alive, and they both lived through that time. And, I'll ask them questions, or I'll run something by them, or they'll say, no, I don't think so, Jackie. So, and I've always had that sense of what life was like at that time, because my mother told me so many of her stories, and I've recounted that in my memoir too. She was a great storyteller, but she had many memories, within the family. My uncles, basically within one family, we had every theater of war covered, so to speak. One of my uncles was in Burma on the Burma Railroad, and he had previously been in a prisoner of war camp in Singapore. Another uncle was at Dunkirk, and another uncle was in Sicily, and so on and so forth. I had an aunt in the WAF. She was in the Women's Air Force, Auxiliary Air Force. Another aunt was in the Wrens. So we had it all covered in a way. So there are those memories. It's not just the reading, but of course I read not every single word, but I think I had about 5 different books on Eleanor Roosevelt, plus her columns, her My Day column. And it was really, you're not only getting a sense of what happened, but also a sense of someone's speech, how they might speak, how they might talk about things, And the other thing that's so important about listening to audio from an era is the locution. And I'll give you an example for that. My grandmother would not have said, for example, "I'll do that in a minute." She'll say, "I'll do that presently." There was no one sharing stuff in those days. No one reached out, no one did anything like that. If you were going to if you wanted to get in touch with someone, you picked up a phone and you made a call, and you dialed. When you answered the phone, you gave the number, and a lot of people still do that, I know. So it's the locution, and that's really important. It's as much a factor of time and place. So, as I say, are there any books? Well, I've got stacks of books. I mean, I couldn't name. I'm trying to actually get rid of some, and it's very hard. My husband suggested a culling, and my eyes nearly popped out of my head. I mean, cull. The words cull and book don't go together to me.
And speaking of Burma, Billy.
Yeah.
His family, both of his sons are in the war, and one of them is prisoner in Burma. And as you were just speaking, I could only think, you had a way to find out about that. I'm very sorry you had that way to find out about it. It must have been horrible, but beautiful, the way you, in fact, I was going to say that the way you weave in that Billy is suffering and his wife is suffering, they've already lost a child. They have 2 sons in different parts of the war, and they are of the working class. We've known Billy as he's come through. And then Maisie's best friend, Priscilla, has 2 sons, 3 sons actually, and they too have been deeply affected by the war. I found that so important to seeing the picture.
Mm-hmm. This is one of the things that when I knew I had a series, which I actually didn't when I first started writing Maisie Dobbs, but when I realized, I have a chance here, I was able to stop and think, what do I want to create? And I realized I wanted to create, if you will, a body of work that went through this tumultuous time in the 20th century, and to follow this, if you will, the ensemble cast and the people that were most connected to them, so that there wasn't just the arc of a story within each book, but there was the arc of the whole big story. So it was kind of like a saga, and which is a very big word to use, I think, but it's the only one I can think of at the moment. And I wanted to sort of see what happened to people on different levels, so that yes, there is the case, and how do they, and all the threads that come into any specific case and challenge within a case. and I want to see how they're impacted by that. But also there are the events of the day, and how do they shake down to ordinary people? So we can see that ourselves, that we have events of the day now impacting us. And suddenly a lot of people are thinking about getting locks on the gas tanks in their car, because we have a situation where for some reason, I don't know why, because certainly gas has gone down dramatically per barrel, but the oil companies are charging us a fortune for our gas, to get from A to B. So that's how something big that's happening in the world is shaking down, the fact that, and how we then talk to people about this event. And also the little events, so you had, the fact that, it's hard to get certain foods, as it was really hard during the war. And the fact that, they make a joke about the sugar, this wouldn't mind a cup of tea with a bit of sugar in it now and again, that sort of thing. Sugar was really impacted. And Britain, because it's an island, depended on its merchant navy. And the merchant navy suffered horrible losses during the war. The U-boats, Hitler wanted to starve out Britain. And they were called the Fourth Service, and they were great heroes. And I haven't even got to them yet, but they were great heroes of the Second World War. So you look at how ordinary people are affected, and that is always, part of the whole story, because you can't leave that sort of thing out. You can't leave out the fact that, the little things like the RAF guys getting together and they couldn't wait to get down the pub for a drink or whatever. But then there was a point where they raised a glass to the people that didn't come home, and so it's weaving in. So it's creating you've got a story, you've got the mystery, which is that archetypal journey through chaos to resolution. But then you've got everything else that anchors a story in its time. I think that would be the best way to put it. Yeah. I get there in the end. I ramble a lot and then I get there in the end.
Someone is asking, in this book, you have to deal with someone who is well-known, real, and you have to weave her into fiction. How did you do that?
With a very light hand, a very light hand indeed. And one of the reasons is to use a quote from, as I do in the epigraph from Eleanor Roosevelt. I obviously have to get permission to do that. And that permission is actually given by her granddaughter. And then I have to give the book. So, but no, apart from anything else, it's with a very light touch. And I've done this before. If I remember rightly, it was with Lloyd George. But so it's there is a limited conversation, but not a long conversation. And then after that, it's basically bringing her alive through the eyes of other people. So that, we see what Anna's like at a certain juncture, and we see what Maisie sees before her. And that's quite easy in a way because of the restriction on the clothing she could bring with it. Roosevelt pretty much wore the same coat and the same hat every single day. And, and she really stood out, because of her height when she went in to meet people. And, again, I'm looking at footage. And so I'm imagining how it would be for Maisie to be standing there watching her and then reading about what she's doing and so on and so forth. And sort of preparing to meet her. Well, she wasn't given much time to prepare to meet her, but, recounting sort of engaging with her. So I think the bottom line is a very light touch. I couldn't see myself writing a novel where I took a real person and had them play a very, very big part, because I don't want to assume that I can do that. And I always take my hat off to writers that do that. And there are writers that have done it so well. I absolutely take my hat off to them.
Well, we take our hats off to you and to us, Maisie and Mark and Anna and Brenda and everyone who are in this saga are real. And we think about them long after we close a book and before you have the next one out. You amaze me how you do this.
Well, thank you.
I want to tell everybody that Jackie very kindly signed book plates for us. And so if you buy the book from Book Passage, you will get a copy with a signed book plate. And I'll be very grateful if you buy the book from Book Passage. I'm so happy that so many people are watching us tonight. And this will be going on YouTube. So if any of your friends missed it, they can see it again. Just go to Book Passage TV and you're going to find it. And I'm so glad you were all here with us tonight, because part of what I love about A Sunlit Weapon and all of Jackie's books, but somehow especially this one, is the intimacy, the Sunday lunches, the time when Maisie and Mark are trying to deal with a problem. It feels so real. And thank you, Jackie, because
thank you.
You've written a book that right now is just what we need to reading tonight.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it's, it's always such an honor to be part of anything at Book Passage.
I will get in trouble if I don't say that if you like audiobooks, that all your independent bookstores work with a company called Libro FM. If you sign up on the website of Book Passage, then every time you buy an audio, you will give us a tiny bit of money. They also do not invade your privacy, which some people do. I wouldn't want to say who, except it's Audible. But please do give yourself the treat of owning this book or the audio, because it's a treasure. Thank you so much, Jackie.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who's come online to listen. I'm very, very grateful for your presence and for your interest in my books. It's really lovely. Thank you for your support.
I feel like